some very interesting news broke out of Alaska, which, as anybody who's been following my reporting knows, was making a very unique and truly grassroots driven push for a 2026 ballot initiative that ultimately fizzled out in part because of the difficulties of fundraising amidst a fascistic takeover of American democracy, to put it one way, or a philanthropic drought during a global recession, to put it another. So, been hearing a lot of chatter about the revival of an Alaska campaign in 2028, and it seems, as per Dr. Bronner's All One blog, for those unfamiliar, David Bronner, psychedelic megadonor extraordinaire, and longtime widely used and supportive psychonaut of the movement, of course, has a blog on his company, Dr. Bronner's website, that he often writes and contributes and publishes thoughts on the psychedelic movement at large. And last week put out a piece re-signaling his support for the Alaska campaign, for Natural Medicine Alaska in particular. What makes this so interesting is the resistance that Alaska faced from the donor class in their 2026 fundraising efforts, largely, it seems, on the foundation, or at least the claimed foundation, that Alaska's inclusion of decriminalization, regardless of incredibly strong polling numbers, I've reported previously 67% in an internal poll conducted by Natural Medicine Alaska in partnership with, I believe, Axiom Strategies, one of the largest conservative, most prominent conservative political consultant firms in the country, found that 67% of Alaska residents were in favor not only of decriminalization of personal use of certain psychedelics, but were also in favor of decriminalizing home cultivation for personal use of certain psychedelics. So numbers that dwarfed the Peasley internal numbers that Massachusetts internal polling generated in the run-up to the 2024 Question 4 campaign that, as many know, failed spectacularly, but also bucks the narrative that was spun in the wake of the Massachusetts campaign by those, and we'll get to this, who may very well, according to some political experts, have tanked the campaign on purpose. We'll talk a little bit about why that might have been. But the narrative that was spun out of Massachusetts, which included the ballot question, the law in question that was on the ballot, featured the same language featured in Alaska, the same language that passed in Colorado back in 2022, and yet failed pretty spectacularly, I believe, 57 to 43 on election day at the ballot box, with 65% of exit of respondents of Massachusetts voters indicating that they weren't even aware until election day that psychedelics were on the ballot. So the narrative that was spun out of that is that voters carte blanche did not want or were not supportive of decriminalization of psychedelics. And that Alaska's insistence upon including it, especially at such a pivotal time with the incoming Trump administration, would make it, even the most promising of numbers curdle at the ballot box if they were given the funding to get off the ground. So what remains, particularly fascinating about the reemergence of psychedelic megadonor David Bronner's support for Natural Medicine Alaska, not that it went anywhere in terms of ideologically or rhetorically. What's most fascinating about Natural Medicine Alaska is that this group of grassroots advocates is led by the Regina Randall, one of the co-founders of the Alaska Entheogenic Awareness Council, and an Indigenous Alaskan Native herself, who is the leader of, by proxy, the first and only Indigenous-led ballot initiative in any political topic, political issue of any kind in American history, and it happens to center around psychedelics. So the historic nature, again, we're in the midst of historic, story after historic story when it comes to the psychedelic movement, but the historic nature of what the Natural Medicine Alaska campaign represents is beyond the scope of any one psychedelic issue. Not to mention, again, a majority conservative state with an overwhelming amount of support internally from residents for decriminalizing personal use and home cultivation of certain psychedelics, bucking the narrative that was spun by a lot of the powers that be, seemingly to cover their own asses, so to speak, not even so to speak, to put it pretty bluntly, about the real reasons for why the $7.5 plus million Question 4 campaign failed so spectacularly at the ballot box. And so what I want to hone in on here with what David Bronner's blog post highlighting his support and reaffirming his support for Natural Medicine Alaska's campaign is that he addresses in a pretty flimsy way, with due respect, the reasonable question of, well, this very similar language initiative failed in hyper-progressive, ultra-progressive Massachusetts. What's different now in hyper-conservative Alaska? And while the narrative initially, again, was spun that decriminalization was to blame, that voters weren't on board with that, what David Bronner cites in his blog post is both the misperception that a paid media campaign would carry the Question 4 campaign through in terms of educating voters, but also very specifically blaming the failure or misunderstanding that the electorate had of the the ballot summary itself. The law itself was the summary that the Attorney General ended up listing on the ballot on Election Day. And so to start there as to why this really makes no sense, especially comparative to the evolving narrative that, originally the narrative as to why it failed was decriminalization, and that meant that nobody in any state was going to be supportive of decriminalization moving forward. It has now become the ballot summary is what screwed us. And yet, in my reporting of the multitude of alleged campaign finance violations that the Question 4 campaign stands reasonably accused of by two former staffers, the rule of thumb in any ballot campaign, again, across any political issue, and speaking with experts that have worked in, cannabis and psychedelics, in trans healthcare equality, ballot initiatives, any number of issues. I've spoken with over a dozen political operatives with expertise in this particular field. And the rule of thumb is that if you don't get a ballot summary that really works for you or that is problematic and that makes the bill seem like something it's not, you sue. You sue the Attorney General and you hash it out in court to get a more fairly worded, accurately worded ballot summary. And yet, despite that being the norm, despite that being the rule of thumb, the Question 4 campaign and the powers that be, the establishment operatives that be, chose not to take that to court and fight for a more honest and accurate ballot summary. You got to wonder why that is, especially when money, seemingly with $7.5 million and frequent bonuses to campaign directors, and again, as I've reported, $130,000 plus diverted from 501c3 nonprofit partner for the Campaign Heroic Hearts Project to non-military veteran political operatives, advocates, to start a new organization. Why couldn't that money have been put towards suing the Attorney General for a more equitable or reasonable ballot summary for the question? And then furthermore, let's dig into the paid media campaign would see us through logic that, by his own word, Bronner deems faulty. But in hindsight, but as we've reported for Lucid News here at Psychedelic States of America, there were over $500,000 worth of advertisements that were previously reserved by the Question 4 campaign that just months before the election they chose to cancel. If paid media was the goal to reach the electorate, why'd you run out of money to buy the ads that you needed at the end? Why didn't you set aside that money to accomplish that goal? Furthermore, why did you divert funding to start a new nonprofit that seemingly served no real purpose in service of the campaign? There are plenty of reasonable questions as to why certain choices were made by campaign leadership, and it continues to be worth repeating that so far, leadership of the campaign has not been willing to actually clarify any of the lines of thinking behind said again, against the political norm, rule of thumb decision making that was made over and over and over and over again. And it is worth repeating the wise words of one of the, longtime political operatives with experience in ballot campaigns that we quoted in part 3 of our question 4 campaign finance violation expose. Either they ran out of money at the end, either they spent their money irresponsibly and ran out of money at the end, couldn't afford the ad buys, or they tanked it on purpose. If you look at the record, and I would encourage folks to go read all 3 parts of the question 4 campaign finance violation expose series that I, and along with my co-reporter Noah Daly, put out at Lucid News last year. If you look at the record of decision making, strategic thinking, the way that they spent their money, it is very difficult to come to many other conclusions other than they either spent the money irresponsibly or they tanked it on purpose. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be.